Thank you, Alan, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm delighted to be here with our opening panel. I have to my right Dave Mackay, who's President and CEO, Royal Bank of Canada. Dale Ponder is National Co-Chair of the law firm Osler and Chair of the new Canadian Business Growth Fund, which we'll learn about. And Chuck Robbins is the Chairman and CEO of Cisco. So thanks to all of you for being here. So we're going to talk about disruption. As we all know, we're living through a time of unprecedented change. We don't have to tell anyone in this room that. But what we want to really focus on is this notion of inclusive growth, how to make sure that with all the opportunity that this change creates, what is the role of the global CEO and the global corporation in making sure that people don't get left behind in that growth. So we're going to have a great conversation, and we will have time for questions, so think about things you'd like to ask our panel. So Dave, let me start with you. From fintech to AI to changing millennial behavior, I think banking has been as disrupted as any industry. So can you just share with us a little bit your perspective on going through that, how you've adapted, and in particular, RBC has dug into the notion of jobs and the impact of all of this disruption on the Canadian workforce, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you've learned there.
No, certainly, succinctly, our world is being challenged by the platform effects of the big companies, the big tech companies. And as we try to maintain digital connectivity to our clients in a world where they entertain themselves, where they shop, where they work, where they communicate in social media, that world, they're signaling their needs to a whole constituent of potential service companies that can meet those. And that's different from what we've ever had in our history. They've always come to tell us what they're doing.
So you mean they're telling Facebook and Google what they want before they tell you?
Through Facebook and Google, exactly, and then they're broadcasting to the world exactly what their needs are, whether they're buying a home, buying a car, getting married, getting divorced, having a child, starting a company. Those needs are being broadcast to the world. So as a service company who's been around 150 years, for the first time, we have to reconnect with our customers in a very different way. And it offers a secular opportunity to redefine your value proposition, define the role you want to play in your customer's life. So we call it reimagining the bank from the customer in. We're trying to build platform effects that reconnect the customer to much broader value propositions. Are you a bank that does operating lending and term lending to a business, or are you a digital CFO? You take the house buying experience and you expand it. You take the car buying experience and you try to manage life cycles of assets, of experiences. And as you redefine the role and you try to move up in the value chain, you reconnect with customers in very different ways. So as you reimagine your bank, it requires very different skills. It requires different types of environments to work in, agile working, and you have to suspend the role you've played historically in a customer's life and rethink the value chain. Because if we don't do it, others will decompose the client value chain and rebundle our services into theirs. So for us, it's very much an opportunity, we think, to play in a much bigger profit pool. It's an opportunity to connect with a customer much earlier on when they would have considered their banking services. And third, it's defensive to say, well, we don't want to be disintermediated in that value chain, and therefore we have to do this for long-term health and survival of our franchise. So for all those reasons, very exciting time to lead in financial services, an opportunity to build a very different type of bank and a platform effect, data-driven, insight-driven, and I think the core skill that you need as a franchise in this world is taking data to knowledge to value. And those three steps are critical because there's a lot of data out there, but unless you create knowledge from it, unless you create value for your customer, for your franchise, then you're going to miss the boat. And that's where AI comes in, that's where blockchain comes in, that's where the capabilities, cloud-based computing, which again drives a very different skill set in your organization, which is kind of one of the themes that we want to talk about today.
So how are you going to make sure that this growth, as you remake the bank this way, is going to capture more people, is going to maybe serve underserved populations, or prepare people that may not be prepared for the workforce of the future?
I think as a CEO, you have to start with a very clear purpose. You need a North Star. You need to define the role of your company in your society, and you have to live it. And I think that's really, really important. For us, it's helping communities prosper and clients thrive, and you have to own that. You have to go back and you have to look at the skill set, not only of your customer base, but for us, we've gone and defined the skill set that's required of youth in our country. Because we're really worried that the next generation will disengage And that if you don't bring them along, we've seen the social instability arise, and communities don't prosper and they're not healthy if you can't engage youth in the future. And we see these skill sets are changing radically. We just produced a report called Humans Wanted that says roughly in Canada, 30 to 40% of our jobs are going to look significantly different 5 years from now. And 10 years from now, 25% of those jobs won't even exist. So how do you get the next generation of youth? We took on a challenge internally. We said we're going to pledge $500 million to future launch and getting the next generation ready for the future of work and contributing to society and creating value in very different ways, because the skills are missing. They don't have the networks, and we're trying to democratize access to jobs, and they don't have the experience that we need. So trying to close all three of those gaps with a commitment to identifying skills, training for those skills, helping them network in society, getting access, and then creating those internships that allow them to connect. So I could go on, but that's kind of in a nutshell.
No, we'll talk a little bit more about jobs with Chuck, who's doing a lot of work with reskilling as well. But Dale, let me get to you. In addition to your role at Osler, as I mentioned, you're now chair of the new Canadian Business Growth Fund, which is also a $500 million fund to address a need for growth capital of mid-sized businesses supported by Canada's leading financial institutions, including RBC. Can you tell us a little bit about this and what the goal is and why there was such a need for it?
Sure. So it's been recognized for some time that Canada does very well from an entrepreneurial startup emerging company sector, but scaling up and taking it to the next level, we don't fare so well relative to the United States. And so government policy identified this, and it was conceived that the private sector really was the best sector to make a difference, to identify the types of companies that would be worth investing in. And all of our leading banks and insurance companies got behind this idea, and they are the sponsors. So this is a for-profit fund, and with a commercial intent. And they are the sponsors behind it. And I have a board of 14 representatives from all of them. And really, it's about providing patient, longer-term capital that otherwise is somewhat fragmented to achieve and not necessarily available to companies that are small cap, mid cap, with real growth prospects. And so trying to unleash that potential and make sure it doesn't get lost and that they can scale up and compete.
Mm-hmm. And while we're talking about disruption, just from put your legal hat on, we talk about disruption in all these industries, but we don't really talk about it in the law field. So is law getting disrupted, and how?
Absolutely. I don't know that there really is an industry out there that isn't being disrupted by digitization. But, with the advent of the Great Recession, classic economic theory, the buyer's market happened. And also, it's a mature industry that really hadn't changed a whole lot for a long, long time. So there is disruption from technology, but also new competitors. And so how we are practicing is quite different than before, and how we'll be practicing 3 years, 5 years, 10 years from now will also be dramatically different. We use artificial intelligence tools, and it's customer focused. It's about, how do you deliver value to your client using the best tools available, recognizing that there are better ways to do some of the things that lawyers do. So I was just in Rome at the International Bar Association conference, where law firms from all over the world congregate. You're probably thinking that's your worst nightmare. Thank God you weren't in Rome that week. But it was fascinating to meet with law firms from the Czech Republic, South Africa, Australia, China, and of course the Wall Street firms. And much of the conversation was about how are you innovating? How are you using artificial intelligence? What are you doing differently? And we're very heavily invested in the technology sector at Osler. So we act from small startups, and I think we've got about 700 of those in our client base, right through to the biggest technology companies. And my theory to that is that this is an industry that we really have got to excel at as a country. We can't rely on natural resources anymore. And so we really made a big investment as a law firm in that. And I think Canada is thriving in that area.
Great. Chuck, over to you. You became CEO of Cisco about a little over 3 years ago. You have been embarking on a pretty major transformation, really going back to the company's roots in networking, powering the internet, basically. I won't drill too far down into that. But can you just talk a little bit about digital disruption from where you sit, everything that's going on in your world, but also how you are viewing, through that, how you're viewing inclusive growth differently than maybe the company was 5 or 10 years ago?
Yeah, first off, thanks for having us here and allowing us to participate. We talk about it internally, and with everything that's happening in the world in technology and with all the new connections, I mean, depending on whose report you look at, there's going to be 40, 50 billion connections by 2023, 2024. So we're bringing more and more connectivity to life, which, as we say, it's creating great opportunity. And at the same time, it's introducing a fair amount of chaos. And it is creating an interesting dynamic in that in developed countries, we do see this divide occurring. And actually, we see people at the time where we see such exceptional progress, we see people who are being left behind. And I think that's certainly reflected in the populism and the things that we've seen around the world. And then in developing countries, there are clearly groups that have not moved forward as fast as others, and we've had strategies to try to help bring them in. And so this is what we're seeing, and I think that it's incumbent upon businesses to actually make sure that we're playing an active role in helping provide opportunity for everyone. And what we do is actually a big piece of that. We've always thought, basically if we can get people connected, then we can get them educated, then they have an opportunity to participate. And we continue that. We have education programs. We have 1.9 million students that are enrolled around the world right now in our programs. We have them in prisons. We have them in refugee camps. I mean, with
you have them in Canada. You have one in rural indigenous populations up in all over Canada.
And we're doing work in the Connected North and delivering connectivity there to actually provide opportunity. And I think but increasingly what we see is that you have to stabilize people before you can even connect them and give them an opportunity. And so issues of hunger and housing and homelessness in developed countries and all those things, we actually have increasingly begun to get involved in that, because if you don't solve those, then you can't do the others. And so it's a complicated world right now where there's so many great things happening, yet we have to make sure that everybody is given the opportunity to participate going forward.
And is helping those things that you mentioned, is that considered CSR for you? I mean, when you wire people in the developed world, that is your business. I mean, there are 4 billion people still not connected to the internet. That's a huge business opportunity for you. So is helping, the other, the homeless that you're working on and things like that, where does that fall? Is that more traditional CSR? Are you seeing that as part of your business model?
I think we're going to move to a place where you're not going to talk about CSR anymore. You're just going to talk about what you do as a company, right? And what the commercial terms are, sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. Sometimes you find yourself in all sorts of varying situations depending on where you are and what you need to be doing. I will say though, in traditional CSR, one of the things that I believe has always been the case is that we build our CSR strategies, but the reality is that we can draw a straight line between whatever activity we're driving and something that's good for our business, right? If I educate millions of students around the world and they think Cisco's helping them find opportunity, they're going to think favorably of us when they're working for companies making networking decisions, right? So you can find a line. You go work on homelessness, and it's much more difficult to find that direct line. And I think increasingly businesses are going to have to get involved in things that you can't see a direct line between that problem and my business, because I think over time that line might be exposed to you. You just don't know what it is yet.
You are on the board of the Business Roundtable. Are other CEOs talking about this? I mean, do you think this has really entered the mainstream dialogue among global CEOs, or is it not yet there?
No, I think it absolutely has. I've looked around the room and I see some people that we've worked on initiatives together in some of these areas, and on reskilling platforms that we drove at the World Economic Forum. Is it as broad-based as we want it to be? Are we doing as much as we should be? I don't know. But I think it's a discussion much like the discussion about diversity and inclusion over the last 15 years. You know, it's moving at a good pace, and we need to get to a point where it's not a discussion about the problem anymore. It's a discussion about how we're all committed to solving these things. How do we do it together?
About outcomes.
Dale, we were talking about this a little bit earlier, but you know, Wall Street is still focused on this whole short-termism. You know, the whole focus on the short term has been an issue that we've talked about at many of our events. It's an ongoing conversation in the business world. But when it comes to doing things like this, I mean, you have dealt with so many, you know, securities issues and publicly traded companies and everything. How hard is it to push these issues through when a company's facing the pressure of the short term, the quarterly performance of Wall Street?
Well, I'm sure each
Well,
of
we'll
you
ask
have a view on this, but of course, you know, that endless quarterly cycle and the things that can happen in the quarter can be constraining in terms of making long-term investments in people and in capital. That's an obvious statement. And you do see from time to time that the pressures are such that it's hard to do that. But this is what leadership is about. And so I think what we're hearing today on this panel is that you know, this has been perhaps somewhat slower in the making, but we're in a world now where globally we're so connected. Whether it's the gap between the haves and the have-nots that's creating the populism movement and you know, what's happening with terrorists and you know, people who are being left behind, that is now a business imperative that people cannot ignore. And it's difficult for us to measure, as you say, and it's great to be able to have metrics on things, but I think that increasingly people recognize that this is good business, and it's great when good business coincides with it's the right thing to do. And I'm not saying that that's always the case, but I really think, I think people increasingly expect this of our corporate icons, and that's what they expect of leadership. Certainly the millennial population expects that. And I think that they're helping to drive that agenda, and I think it's a must-do.
Yeah, but Dave, on your earnings calls, I can't imagine the analysts being excited if you mentioned the words inclusive growth.
No, but I would say increasingly when I meet with the buy side, with our true long-term institutional investors, they do ask about what are you doing in your communities, how are you engaged? And there is a lot of empirical proof, and we've studied it ourselves, linking your corporate purpose and an engaged employee base and outperformance in the marketplace, and it goes over a long period of time. So we fundamentally buy in to the fact that living our corporate purpose, helping communities prosper and clients thrive, drives higher engagement, which everybody tracks, leads to outperformance over a long cycle. And those are the conversations that we have with our long-term investors. And I always say your strategy attracts the type of investor you ask for. And therefore, if you're articulating how you're leading your business, how you're driving results, we all face short-term pressure. But you know, you look at Larry Fink's letter, and he encourages you to put a strategy out there and to think about your corporate social responsibility. The two go hand in hand. So it's how you communicate with the marketplace.
Larry
it's not
Fink,
impossible.
BlackRock, who most people probably know, put out a very, very powerful shareholders letter earlier this year saying just that. We're going to open it up in just a minute, but Chuck, I want you to respond to the Wall Street question, and then also I want to ask you. You know, we're talking. This is not a diversity panel, but diversity really plays into everything that we're talking about these days. So to what degree does having a diverse board, a diverse management team at the very top shift how a company thinks about inclusive growth? I'm just curious if you think that makes a difference.
Yeah, I think, first of all, I think that to the question about our investors and how they feel about these types of activities, which is effectively what we're asking, you've got ESG funds that are beginning to, you know, show up, although they're small today. I think the bigger issue is increasingly these conversations are happening, and our customers actually want to know what are you doing? And our partners want to know, our suppliers want to know, and our employees, and perhaps most importantly, our future employees want to know, where do you stand on all this stuff? So ultimately, if you're not engaged, then you won't be attracting the talent, which I think is very, you know, has a very high business impact. On the diversity front, look, we have gone at this for a very long time. And I sit today where I have 11 direct reports, and 5 of those 11 are female in Silicon Valley, which is very unusual.
Great.
And then we had 4 board members of the 10 or 11 independents that were female as well. And you clearly have, I mean, I don't want this to sound bad, but I mean, I think when you get that level of diversity, you have a good mix of different levels of compassion, different levels of thinking about these things, so you get a much more balanced view sometimes than you might in a non-diverse environment. I'll leave it at that. Around perhaps you just need to focus on running a business and stop trying to solve the world's problems. You know, so I think it matters. But the great news about that discussion is, you know, we're not having to even convince employees anymore that it's important or help them understand why it's important. A decade ago, it was like, well, it's the right thing to do. Right? And today, it's still the right thing to do, but now people understand the underlying value that you get when you have a real diverse team. So that leads back to some of these other initiatives and driving, you know, education efforts that are targeted at getting more women into technology fields earlier in their careers, trying to get them motivated early so that you can fit. So it's all connected.
Mm-hmm. Who's got a question? Anyone? I've certainly got more.
Turn up the lights and I see lots of people I know.
All right. Dave, why don't you take that diversity question just briefly before we move on?
No, we think of diversity along so many fronts of experience, background, because for two drivers. One, to serve the market, you have to hire the market, and therefore we live in a very diverse country. We operate in 41 countries around the world, and therefore to really meet our customer needs and understand our customer needs, we have to hire the market. So it's a great business driver, and it's important for strategy, and it's important for business outcomes. And it happens to be the right thing to do, but it's really business driven. Mm-hmm. We have seen the innovation agenda accelerate significantly with diversity. Diversity of experience, diversity of background, diversity of necessity, all dimensions. And we run this program called Amply, where we take students in every year and we group them into groups of 6, and we give them our toughest problems to solve. And our only prerequisite is they've never worked for a bank. They come with English backgrounds, with history backgrounds, with engineering, with mathematics, and we just put them into these groups, male, female, different parts of the world. And we filed 15 patents from that summer student group of 100 employees this year, solving our toughest programs. And that's diversity in action. And our challenge to the business community is you cannot afford not to do this, because if we're finding these answers, your competitors are finding these answers. So the innovation agenda, I think, really supports. So for those two perspectives, hire the market to win and innovate with diversity, we see clear outcomes.
Dave, I want to ask you, what can be done in financial services to better reach populations that are not currently being reached? And how can technology help with that?
I think as we digitize our world and we democratize access to the financial system, whether it's fintech alone or fintechs partnering with big firms or big firms innovating increasingly in more agile ways, I think we are creating services and capabilities that are much more accessible to the banking industry than our traditional bricks and mortar world, where we focused networks on market opportunity, digitizing who we are today, which is not sufficient to be strategically successful, but is a great play on accessibility to the marketplace. I think we're being challenged by fintechs to do that, particularly in the payments business. I think it's really healthy, and I think we are democratizing access to the system through that innovation.
Dale, when you think about the kinds of companies that the fund is going to fund, are you looking at all at the products they're offering or the services they're offering? I'm just thinking about the topic of inclusive growth. It seems that for a while, at least in the US anyway, and I've written about this, there were companies being started to do things that didn't really seem to help anybody, like deliver booze in under an hour and, deliver a massage therapist to my door, things like that. I mean, are you applying any kind of filter to the kinds of businesses you're funding that such that they might
short
actually help make the world a better place?
Short answer to that, yes. Because of course our sponsors are the leading Canadian banks and insurance companies, and so our policies have to align with those of our sponsors. But it's still a proving ground with respect to the appetite for this particular type of financing, and we've done our first investment. We launched formally in June, and just announced the first investment a couple of weeks ago. But yes, it's being screened from that perspective, and it'll get further refined as we really test the market case and where the need is.
No booze delivery, though, for now.
Just have the massage therapist bring the booze.
Right, there you go.
Productivity
Chuck,
right there.
Exactly.
sort of related question. I mean, just talking about product, to what degree does the inclusive growth conversation have to drill down to the product itself? Do we need different smartphones that are more accessible and lower price? I mean, we have examples of that, but do we need to really think granularly like that about the products that companies are offering to make them more inclusive and more accessible?
Look, I think, I'll just give you an example. We worked for the last 2.5, 3 years with Mukesh Ambani in India to build out the largest all-IP mobile network in the world. And I can tell you, we had thousands of people on the ground, like ongoing, to get this network built. And they also then subsequently came in and they created these inexpensive plans, because built fresh, in order to deliver at a certain cost. They built their own phones that they're delivering at an unbelievable rate. And they have 200 million subscribers. They hit 100 million subscribers in 7 months. And so you're bringing high-speed access to every part of India that didn't exist before, and you're giving them a smartphone with all the content and all this. And you're giving those people the opportunity. Right? So inclusive growth then gives them an opportunity. Some of the businesses that people are beginning to start, the engagement, the education, everything that you can drive. So I think for the general question, that's the case. For us, we have to think about, in some parts of the world, do we build more minimally viable products that fit a market that allow to scale at a certain price point, et cetera. And we're constantly thinking about that as well. But I think the India example is it doesn't get much better until they move in and start doing it in North Africa, and then you have a second wave.
I think in the services industry, when you talk about data, AI certainly has the ability to remove bias from the system. But we just made a donation as we opened another AI center in Montreal last week to the Canadian Institute for Advanced Research to study ethical AI. Because as we're coding these models and they're learning from each other, there is the opportunity to reintroduce a different type of bias into our predictive nature of our artificial intelligence. So we think it's really important to get ahead of that. So while, on one hand, we think we can certainly remove bias by using bots and using technology, we have to be very conscious not to. So I think technologies are going to help us in the service industry. I think in a balanced way, remove bias and make it more open and democratize it.
We only have a few minutes left, but I want to ask each of you, so we're just barely getting our arms around this wave of digital disruption. We don't have our arms around it yet, but we're just finally coming to terms with it. What's the next wave going to come from? I mean, this was all about the internet changing everything. What is the next wave going to come from? Let me start with you, Dave, and we'll just go down. I mean, you were a computer programmer, so that's your background.
Next
Tell
wave
us.
of technology and the impact. I'm really focused myself on platform effects. I mean, I think it's going to people are changing the way they work, the way they communicate, the way they entertain themselves, and the way they shop. And this is going to fundamentally realign businesses and value chains and value models for a long period to come. And we're centralizing knowledge, we're centralizing power. So we're in an era of scale and strength and data that is going to play out for some period of time, but we're going through another fundamental change in voice activation, virtual reality, and interacting in a digital world in a very different way. With some of the VR work that we're doing and others are doing is pretty phenomenal. So the way we interact with the physical world and the way we interact with the digital world is completely changing, and with that we will destroy industries and companies and jobs, and with that we will create probably as many or more. And how we take society on this journey is critical. I think we could all probably agree we're going to get to a better place, but that journey through history has never been without bumps. And there's been wars and there's been conflict, because if you can't bring people with you, and as leaders, I think we're here at these types of events to talk about how do you bring 7 billion people on this journey and do it well, because it's how we do it not the ultimate destination that's going to dictate a lot of our success.
Dale, I know you're not a technology person, but just in terms of general next wave shifts, what do you see happening?
I did
Very
start in
quickly,
math
we're
and
almost running
science,
out of
though.
time. Okay, there we go.
Yeah, so as you describe it, I mean, this is going to be a bumpy road for sure, and change that had predated this, the earlier industrial revolutions, didn't happen as quickly as this one is. So the pace of change on this, takes your breath away, actually, because it's accelerating, right, exponentially as we go along here. So I think how we figure out, certainly what Dave has identified is critical, because there's lots of opportunity for social and political disruption coming out of this. But how we collaborate together with artificial intelligence. So how do we see it positively as an enabler and positively in the workforce versus segments of society worrying too much about them being displaced, and because I think there is a lot of scope for collaboration.
Right. Yeah, you're an optimist on that too, Dave. Chuck, we'll give you the last word.
Yeah, I think, look, the technology transitions are well documented. I mean, AI, automation, machine learning, just pick your buzzwords, blockchain. And those things are usually hyped for almost a decade before they actually become real in scale. They really are. I mean, if you think about technology trends, we talk about them for a lot longer than, long time before they actually come to fruition. So I think the bigger thing is, but tying back to Dave's point and Dale's point on the industrial revolution, it happened slower and across a discrete set of sort of workers, and now we're facing it at a pace we've never seen before across virtually every industry, every job possibly that we see. And so the whole debate about whether job dislocation is going to occur hopefully is behind us. But this is why I think part of our problem is, if we don't come together and figure out how we proactively build strategies to help those who are capable of being reskilled into new jobs, if we're not doing that, then the populism that we've seen so far is just the tip of the iceberg. The second thing that I think is so important, and we spend more of our time on this than we ever dreamed, at least I ever dreamed I would, and I was a computer programmer as well, by the way. We got to get the government policies aligned to the pace and to the technology, because the pace at which we're regulating this stuff and the knowledge that's required to regulate it is going to potentially create a massive problem. And then just the overall geopolitical dynamics.
Right.
There's an old saying from a long time ago, when products are crossing borders, armies don't. And so I think we need to really focus on bringing everything together, focus on the future.
Great point to end on, and I think we'll be discussing all of these issues over the next 3 days. So thanks to all of you for being here today. Please join me in thanking my wonderful panel.
Thank you.